welcome to this Care Experience and Culture event. My name is Dee Michelle and I'm an academic at the University of Adelaide on Kaurna land in South Australia. Thanks so much to the Foundling Museum for hosting our book club event tonight. Rosie Canning is there in person at the Foundling Museum in London, along with two of our panellists, Kathleen Palmer and Josie Pearse. Justine Cowan is in Atlanta, Georgia, and as I said, I'm in South Australia. For those who've not been to a Care Experience and Culture event, I'll give a bit of a background on Care Experience and Culture first. Rosie Canning and I met online in 2018, on Twitter before Elon Musk, and in person in London in April 2019. My partner and I had been in the Netherlands visiting our eldest son and his partner, and we'd arranged as one of the very first things to do in London was to meet Rosie at the Foundling Museum in Brunswick Square. And what a treat that was. Not only did I get to meet the famous Rosie Canning in person after months of online chat, but there was Lem Sisay's Superman was a Foundling exhibition still on the walls, and I was beyond excited. I'd accidentally or serendipitously found out about Lem Sisay in 2011, the day after he left Australia, unfortunately. He'd been in Adelaide for a couple of events at the University of South Australia just down the road, so I was kicking myself that I'd missed him. I've referred to Lem Sisay's work often since then, particularly his observation about the mismatch between popular fictional characters who've been displaced from birth family and actual kids in care who were so often seen as super dads rather than superheroes. Lem Sisay's work also inspired me to do a blog showing that real-life care experience people can often be every bit as amazing as fictional characters. Rosie had also been inspired by Lem Sisay, and that's what led her to do a PhD at that Southampton University. It was this mutual interest in the representation of care experience people that encouraged Rosie and I to apply to the Wellland Trust in the UK for some funding to put together a digital archive of literature, films, television shows, etc., which feature care experience people, as well as writers, actors, performers who are care experience themselves. I'm always grateful for the technology that enables Rosie and I to work together. I wasn't even in Adelaide when we began writing to the Wellland Trust. I was up on the Gold Coast helping out my daughter with her littlies while her husband was away. Anyway, our aim for Care Experience and Culture is to contribute toward changing community attitudes about care experience people as a group. Although there are occasional success stories in the media about care experience people, and far more so in the UK than in Australia, in the main, a single story is told. That story is about how we are overrepresented in the prison, mental ill health and homelessness populations. Instead of only being seen through that current single lens, which is an indictment on state care systems everywhere, we want us to be recognised as a creative group, despite and even because of often experiencing hardship and trauma. Rosie and I launched the Care Experience and Culture Digital Archive during the inaugural Care Experience History Month in April 2021, thanks in large measure not only to the funding from the Wellland Trust, but also to the invaluable help of Jamie Crabb, who is an accredited therapist based in North London, as well as a writer and something of a computer whiz. And here we are in November 2022 with a fabulous lineup for our book club event. And thanks to technology, this is an international event. Again, thanks so much to the Foundling Museum for hosting this hybrid event. And it's my pleasure to welcome our first speaker, Kathleen Palmer, who is the Foundling Museum curator. Kathleen will talk to us about the Foundling Hospital and its history. Over to you, Kathleen.
So, hello and welcome to the Foundling Museum, for those of you, well, near and far. I'm the curator of exhibitions and displays at the Foundling Museum. So we tell the story of the Foundling Hospital, the UK's first children's charity and its first public art gallery, which was the outcome of Thomas Coram's incredible project to set up a hospital for foundlings designed to care for and educate London's most vulnerable citizens. So the Foundling Museum's mission is to inspire change through the power of the arts. So for those of you joining on Zoom, this is the museum. So the Foundling Hospital was established in 1739 after a long and tireless campaign by an individual businessman called Thomas Coram. to take in babies who would otherwise have been abandoned on the streets of London. That was the intention. So today, the institution continues as the children's charity Quorum, working mainly in adoption and fostering support. The Foundling Museum is a separate charity set up to care for the heritage and interpret it for the public. So we see ourselves as a force for change, seeking to connect past and present with our art and our objects, and use creativity to improve young lives, helping to shape a better future. So our story is about the lives of the children who grew up here and the way that the hospital was run. But it's also an extraordinary story of how artists of every discipline got involved to help establish the charity. So you'll see that this is an image of the original Foundling Hospital. And you'll see that the museum is not, in fact, in that original building. The original Foundling Hospital was demolished in the late 1920s in order to free up the land and resources to build a completely brand new hospital outside of London in the countryside. So when the Foundling Hospital was first built, it was actually on the edge of London, believe it or not. So it was on a greenfield site. So to kind of recreate that fresh air and country situation, the decision was taken to move the hospital. So Quorum's 17-year campaign culminated in the granting of a royal charter to set up the hospital. And the hospital opened its doors in temporary premises in Hatton Garden in 1741, and 18 boys and 12 girls were admitted on the first 136 children in the first year. And at the same time, the funds were being raised for a permanent building for the hospital on very close to this site. It's basically over there, for those of you who are in the room. So unlike many of its equivalents on the continent, the hospital's admissions were never completely anonymous. Babies had to be brought in person, and details were taken of any identifying marks on the child, the clothing, the name of the parent, the mother or parents. Fabric sample was often taken from either the child or the mother's clothing. Half was kept by the mother and half by the hospital. And the record was then sealed up, often with the addition of a small physical object or token inside. And this was to confirm the identity of the parent if they were able to come back and reclaim the child. So in the earliest years, the cost of keeping the child had to be repaid in order to make a claim. And this stopped in 1764. And once this demand ended, about 3 or 4 children a year were reclaimed. And to start with, babies only under 2 months were accepted. This was later extended to up to 1 year old. And that basically stayed the policy right the way through until the hospital closed for residential care in the 1950s. So it was always babies that were admitted rather than older children. And to start with, the need could be of any kind. It's a little bit later that the illegitimacy becomes a key part of the admissions policy. At first, it's any need, and only babies who had obviously had infectious diseases were turned away to protect the other children in the hospital. So at the time when the hospital was established, London was growing really fast. The population almost doubled to 1 million between 1700 and 1800. And the existing systems of kind of poor relief and help for people in trouble started to break down because of the movement of people. So this was a time of really high child mortality. It was the peak of the gin craze, which was a bit like the sort of crack of its day. And it's estimated that over 1,000 babies a year were being abandoned in London, with their parents unable to care for them for reasons of either poverty or illegitimacy. So Thomas Quorum's business had been in shipbuilding in America. He came back to London kind of in retirement, and he was really struck by the changing social situation and embarked on this 17-year campaign to really try and make a difference through setting up the Foundling Hospital. So he needed to persuade the rich and powerful, the aristocrats, successful professionals, and above all, the king, in order to get a royal charter to set up the institution. He appealed to patriotism, the need for soldiers, sailors, and workers for the nation, as well as to human compassion to make his case. And he was eventually successful. So this is Thomas Coram's portrait on the left. It's the first artwork that was donated to the hospital. It was donated by the artist William Hogarth. And he became a huge supporter of the hospital's work. He's thought to have designed the children's uniforms, the coat of arms for the hospital, and encouraged his circle of artists and of all kinds to support the hospital by donating work. So really made it a destination for wealthy people to come and see the artworks and be encouraged to support the hospital's work. So Hogarth was somebody who'd experienced a precarious childhood himself. His father had been imprisoned in the Fleet prison for debt. So he had some sense of what it was like to be disadvantaged in childhood. So he was an active supporter of the cause. The composer, George Frederick Handel, came a little bit later to the cause, but he quickly became equally invaluable to the hospital's fundraising efforts. So Handel grew up in the town of Halle in Germany, which had an enormous orphanage. So he was very familiar with the idea of giving and supporting to that sort of cause. He offered to conduct a benefit concert to support the completion of the hospital's chapel, which included the first performance of the Foundling Hospital Anthem, which you can see the score of here. And that contains the first iteration of his very famous Hallelujah chorus. And it was performances at the hospital's chapel which popularised his Messiah, which is probably his best known one, and also includes the Hallelujah chorus. So over his lifetime, these benefit concerts raised over £7,000, which is 7 million in sort of today's money. So a really important contribution. And he left a copy of the score of Messiah to the hospital so that they could continue to perform it after his death. So these collaborations with artists continue today as we bring great artists together to work alongside marginalised and vulnerable young people, and hopefully to inspire our visitors to think about ways in which they too can help to make the world a better place for young people in particular. So here we've got the sound recordist Chris Watson. These are 3 of our Foundling Fellowships. So Dee mentioned Lem Sisse and his project. So this is his Superman Was a Foundling, which just highlights the care experience characters in fiction. Chris Watson is known for his kind of nature recordings, and he recorded a local dawn chorus with young people with care experience in the local area. And that's something that you can hear in the museum today. It plays as audio on the staircase, which is the original staircase from the boys' wing of the Foundling Hospital. So the building that we're in was built in the 1930s as a kind of headquarters for the Foundling Hospital as a charity. And we think that it's somewhere where mothers would come and be interviewed before they brought their children to be taken into hospital's care. So it's anything old in this building actually is old. Anything that looks old. So it incorporates quite a lot of original architectural features from the Foundling Hospital itself. The third fellowship that I wanted to highlight was with artist Grayson Perry. And he did a project with young people working with Coram, being supported by Coram, to create this amazing piece of ceramic. And they held an exhibition of their ceramic works that they'd made alongside him, but they all contributed to the kind of content and meaning of that piece. So I just wanted to come on a little bit to our current work with artists today. So a key part of our work is a program called Tracing Our Tales. And it's a traineeship program for care experienced young people between the age of 18 and 30. So we've made it quite a broad age group. And they're learning either creative writing or art skills, and also teaching skills so that they can have work supporting workshops in the museum and in other museums. So music and story were combined in their recent display, A Voice. This was created with the artist who leads the program with us and the young people. And it combines Handel's music with an interview with a former pupil, John Caldecott, talking about his life in and beyond the Foundling Hospital. And also here are 3 images from another display created by the previous year's trainees called Fear. So it was just talking about what they are afraid of and how they deal with those fears, and thinking about just coming to terms with some of them. So this is something that we handle with great, obviously. We've got an exhibition on at the moment. So my part of our work is really the exhibitions programme. So our current exhibition looks at the life stories that we've managed to trace through a PhD research project of African and Asian children who were at the Foundling Hospital in the 18th century. And this has been quite painstaking work because ethnicity wasn't systematically recorded by the hospital on admission. So we've had to comb through the archive to track down these children and their life stories. So the exhibition contains the life stories of about 50 children we've traced in that period, from sort of 1740 through to 1820. And this is, you know, we tackle lots of different ways of entering into the hospital story, but we feel it's really important to try and tell life stories in particular. We don't have very many that we're able to tell firsthand. There are very few. So this one, we've been piecing together the life stories purely from the kind of administrative records of the hospital. But we feel it's really important to try and track those. So there's one life story that we've been able to track right the way through from sort of the admission right the way through to sort of early adulthood. And this is a young woman, Fanny Kenyon. So this is the note of her admission to the hospital, one of the contemporary works that featured in the exhibition. So because we don't have any portraits or any first-hand, we've included the voices of contemporary artists of colour who've addressed issues that relate to the sort of subject matter of the show in different ways. So Fanny Kenyon was admitted. She was the daughter of a woman in domestic service, and she had a child together with a colleague in domestic service called George Clark. And on the admission records, he's noted as being a man of colour. They lived together for a short while. They left service, lived together for a short while in London as man and wife, but he abandoned her, and she came to the Foundling Hospital for support. Her child was named Fanny Kenyon. Like all children coming to the hospital, she was sent out to a wet nurse to be fostered in her earliest years, so until she was about 4 or 5. When she came back, she was one of the lucky ones and survived early childhood, which not all of the children did in the 18th century, and there was quite a high mortality rate in and out of the hospital. She was a very bright girl. She did really well in her education. She was taken on, she was requested specifically as an apprentice by a woman called Miss Mackenzie, who was quite conscious of the fact that Fanny might experience discrimination and racism outside of the hospital. And she said, you know, I want to support her and get her off to a good start. She came, after that, she moved to a variety of different apprentice masters. She had about 6 different places, so she did experience some difficulties through her apprenticeship period. And ultimately, we were able to trace her into adulthood because she came into contact with the law. She was convicted of stealing from a master. She was quite a vulnerable young woman. And the last trace we have of her is in a refuge for destitute young women who came out of prison. And she's in the records as basically having lots of fights with the authorities. So she was quite a feisty young woman, and we would love to know what happened to her after that. But we haven't yet been able to find any traces, because it's really only when people come up against administrative records that we encounter them. So, and it can be quite difficult with young women if they marry and change their name. We can lose them if they end up with a much more common name. Fanny Kenyon was just interesting enough as a name to be able to track her into the court system, but so far not beyond. She's one of the children that we know the most about, but she's one where her personality comes across outside of the administrative record. I want to talk a little bit about another exhibition that we did, which is about a family called George King. He was admitted in the late 1780s to the Foundling Hospital and found himself later at so he is the only 18th century foundling where we have a first-hand memoir. This is like gold dust for us. We have so few first-hand accounts. So this is his memoir. I'm going to do a lightning dash through his life story. He describes himself as being born in Hemel Hempstead. In fact, that's where he was fostered. So he skims very gently over his origins when writing about himself. He's presenting himself in the best possible light. And clearly there's a source of discomfort around talking about his origins in the hospital. And he probably didn't know anything about who his mother was. We've been able to see, but he wouldn't have known. So she was a young woman called Mary Miller, who came from outside of marriage and was supported by the Foundling Hospital and made a good case to them. So he was fostered, came in Hemel Hempstead, came back in. He got an excellent education in the Foundling Hospital. It was better than a child of his kind of status would have got outside of the hospital. At this stage, the hospital is offering a really extraordinary level of care. It's not a workhouse, it's something very different that they're offering. It's good education, good food, good clothing, and actually a more family atmosphere than you find in hospital later. You have long staying staff who take a real genuine interest in the children. And he's taken under the wing of the schoolmaster, who he stays in contact with and comes back to visit in later life. Interesting. He is apprenticed to a confectioner, has a difficult time in his apprenticeship, and he is bullied by one of the older apprentices, and he actually runs away from this apprenticeship as a result. And he finds himself, he goes off, decides to go off to sea, gets a very romantic account from another former pupil of the hospital, and thinks that he's going to go off and become a merchant seaman and walk straight into a press gang. And this is just 2 years before the Battle of Trafalgar. So he finds himself on board Polyphemus and setting out towards the Battle of Trafalgar. So we have an account from him of the battle, quite an extraordinary thing. So he talked about being stripped to the waist like the other men, it being quite a warm day. He was quartered at the second gun on the forecastle. I alternately looked over the gangway to see the position of the two fleets, but the smoke prevented me. Polyphemus running under the 80-gun French ship Black Heel. So when the smoke clears, George witnessed a beautiful view of the combined fleets, which had formed a crescent. And the centre of the enemy's line was the Spanish admiral, his flag flying on board the Santísima Trinidad, with the Spanish flagship. So after 3 hours of unrelenting combat, all appeared to be in confusion. About 6 o'clock, the ship Black Heel blew up with a tremendous explosion, burying all of the slain. So it's clearly quite a sort of traumatic experience, but one that he would tell the story of. That's one of the reasons we think that he probably wrote a memoir, because people would have been anxious to hear about a particular experience. So that night, he's exceptionally exhausted. They have pistols because they have French prisoners on board the ship. They've all been issued with pistols, and he nearly shoots himself. He goes to sleep with the pistols tucked under his arm, and one of them goes off. But it doesn't go off properly, so he survives that experience. Then the memoir goes on to talk about another 30 years at sea. So we get all his different voyages, his first crossing of the equator, when there's a great sort of sailor's ritual when you do that. It's called crossing the line, and there's lots of silliness, dressing up, shaving of beards and that sort of thing. So he talks about that experience. He talks about the occasional trips back to dry land and his periods on leave. George becomes quite a drinker, which is one of the reasons I think that his memoir wasn't taken really seriously enough for a long time, because he tells a good yarn. He's got a fantastic narrative voice. It's really extraordinary. He leaves the Navy after 30 years or so. He works as a merchant seaman. He tries to find lots of different avenues of work and ends up back at sea. His health has started to fail at a stage. He ends up in South Carolina. So he witnesses enslaved people, plantations. He goes and works in a community that's basically financed by the cotton trade. And he goes there, he's offered a job as a school teacher because he has this tremendous education from the Foundling Hospital. He's able to teach the local town to read and write. So he was teaching adults as well as children in the school. But he chooses not to stay, and we don't really know why. He doesn't make it very explicit. We don't know if there was some sense of discomfort with what he was doing, or he just really struggled to settle after the kind of life that he'd had. It's quite difficult to read between the lines, but he does choose to come back to England. He was briefly married, but his wife died. He marries again in later life. So he comes back to England, and he eventually applies to the Hospital for Seamen at Greenwich. And he's extremely lucky, and he gets a place there. And that sets him up for the remainder of his life with a sort of pension and care. He's in residence there for a while, but again, his education comes into play. He's given a job as clerk to the Greenwich Hospital Chapel. And he's able to move out, rent his own little house, and he marries at that stage in really late life. And we don't know if he writes the memoir with his family, but he finds himself back again in an institution, in a uniform, meals in the institution, back in life. But he's also respected for his service at Trafalgar tremendously. There's a renewed kind of interest in Trafalgar stage. He's given a medal for having been at Trafalgar. You know, he has a good and happy old age, which is rare and lovely to find in a family story. And I will stop there because I've
Thank you, Kathleen. That was just a fantastic overview of past and present. The presentation of current exhibitions and the work you were doing is really exciting. And I also love that, very treasured story of George King. And so I'm going to introduce Justine Cowan, who lives in Atlanta, Georgia. Justine is an American attorney and environmentalist. She's also the author of the remarkable book, The Secret Life of Dorothy Soames. The Secret Life of Dorothy Soames is part memoir, part family history, and part excellent scholarship as Justine explores her mother's upbringing in London's the Foundling Hospital and eventual migration to the United States. Justine knew nothing about her mother's past when she was growing up, but she experienced her mother as difficult, obsessed even with ensuring Justine became enculturated into the upper classes with 6 a.m. music lessons, boarding school, and correct diction. It was only after her mother's death that Justine went on an adventure, and I'm not sure if that's the word you'd use, Justine, to discover the truth about her mother, who she finds out was at one point a child called Dorothy Soames. So here to tell us about that adventure is Justine Cowan. Welcome, Justine.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. We've said it's an international event, and that means that I'm in Atlanta, Georgia right now. We have a little bit of a tropical storm moving through, and it's very early in the morning, so everyone's asleep and it's a little bit dark out. So if I'm a little bleary-eyed and not quite as sharp as usual, that's because I have not even finished my first cup of coffee. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, the adventure that I went on. Well, a little bit about my background and where I grew up. So I grew up near San Francisco in California, and it really seemed quite idyllic. My mother was very polished and posh, as they say, as my publisher once said. And she had a very British accent. And as it's been mentioned, I was sent to all sorts of lessons. And there was a story that was told as a child that my mother was illegitimate, or I don't even know if it was told. Somehow I just knew that my mother was illegitimate. And it was just something that I knew, but I knew nothing else. And there was a story that my mother was from blue blood, and that was it. I didn't know much more, and I really had no reason to doubt it. She told me that she went to the Royal Academy of Music in London, and there was all sorts of stories about, the wonderful things that she had done, and and that was the story that I had grown up with. This was the story that I grew up with, and then when I was 19 years old, I was at Berkeley University of California, Berkeley, and my father called me and he said, "You have to come home. There's something wrong with your mother." She had been driving through the streets, and he had chased after her, and she was trying to go to the hospital. And I said, "Well, is she sick? Is there anything wrong?" And he said, "No, she's not sick. But she's trying to go to the hospital." And so you have to come home and take care of her. And so I came home, and this is a book, so I'm just going to read a little bit about the book, where I discovered that my mother had a really big secret. The room was dim, but I could make out my mother's silhouette as she sat up in bed. Her nightgown reflected the light streaming through the gaps in the heavy white curtains. She was holding a notepad. I immediately recognized her old-fashioned calligraphic script with its precise bends and curves. I couldn't make out the words in the shadowy light, but I saw deep indentations in the thinly lined paper, along with dark smudges and small tears where it looked like a pencil might have broken. She turned the notepad toward me, and a splash of morning light illuminated the page. Each line contained a name written over and over with the same unwavering precision. It was a name I had never heard before and would not hear again for many years. Dorothy Soames, Dorothy Soames, Dorothy Soames. It would be many years before I learned who Dorothy Soames was. It was a name I had never heard before, and wouldn't hear again for many years. I went on a trip to London with my husband after my mother's death, and because of that, I wanted to know what had happened with my mother's past. And that's when I learned that my mother had been raised at the Hospital for the Maintenance and Education of Exposed and Inserted Young Children, which is, of course, commonly known as the Foundling Hospital. It was a place started in the 1700s where illegitimate children were raised for service. And it also served a second purpose, and that was to save fallen women, women who became pregnant out of wedlock. And if they had a place to send their child, they could return back to their station in life. And so I went to England and was able to access my mother's files at what's called Coram now, which was the Foundling Hospital, and learn a lot about my mother's past. The first thing I learned was that my grandmother had become pregnant and had given up and wanted to give up her child. And she had to go through a very rigorous application process to be able to give up her child, my mother, to make sure that she could prove that she had good character, and that being able to give the child to the Foundling Hospital would allow her to return to her station in life. And this process actually took several weeks. And it included all sorts of things, such as interviewing of all the men in her life. They interviewed her doctor, they interviewed her brother, and they interviewed her pastor. And all of the questions were focused on whether or not my grandmother was a moral person. And this is one piece of information I found in the files. Dr. Mackey attested that he had never heard the slightest hint or suggestion of any moral turpitude in her character. In fact, the recent lapse came as a great surprise to me, and from what I know of her, I am pretty certain it will never happen again. And what happened, she passed the test. They decided, she went before a panel of men who interviewed her as well after all of this rigorous investigation into her character, and she was deemed moral enough to give her child to the Foundling Hospital. And this is the actual receipt that was given to my grandmother for my mother. It was a receipt that had been, this type of receipt had been used for over a century. And in fact, Charles Dickens had written about it in one of his articles in his magazine. So this is where my mother was. She was in Berkhamsted, which is just outside of London. This is opening day of Berkhamsted, where a new campus was built. And they wore these uniforms, a brown uniform that was really a symbol of their shame. And this is the campus. And this is actually an older dormitory, but the dormitories, they were organized. I've heard two stories that either in alphabet or by height. But the one thing that was always similar was that the dormitories were very simple. There were no personal belongings allowed, and very stark. And here's some more pictures from the Foundling Hospital. And this picture is of the chapel, and my mother is actually in this photo. And as you can see, there's all of these wonderful posed photos, and that was very common to have these posed photos. And this one is one of my favorites. Lydia Carmichael is a foundling that I got to know along the way, a former foundling, and she was good friends with my mother. And she told me about this photo, that they would come in and they would have staged photos. And if you show her this picture, she'll start to laugh and say, "Oh, look at all these toys." They brought in all of the toys, and she is in this photo. They brought in all of the toys for the photos, and then after, they took them all away. And that is how staged these photos were. When I was just going through all of the files, it was unusual. Usually the files were not very large, but my mother's was quite thick. And what I found in there were letters from my grandmother. And my grandmother, it was clear that my grandmother was forced to give up my mother and that she didn't want to. And it was all because of the shame of being pregnant outside of marriage. And I discovered letter after letter after letter after letter, year after year. My grandmother would write every month. It would just be scraps of paper, whatever it was, asking to see how her little girl was. She asked to come see her. And, here's one response that she got was that she was in receipt of the letter and she cannot visit the child. And she would write month after month, year after year, asking to how her little girl was. And she would get back these heartbreaking, very brief typed letters. And that was all she got. And then something happened. War broke out. And my mother did the amazing thing of running away. And it had unheard of. But she and another little girl snuck out the back and made their way to London. And it was quite an amazing story. And at the same time, my grandmother was yet again trying to get her child back. And, this is years after she'd given up her child, and she's still trying to get her child back. So it was a pretty amazing story. And so my grandmother never gave up. And after my mother ran away, I think she became so much of a trouble that they decided to give my mother back to her mother. That didn't happen until my mother had already been in this institution for over 12 years. During that time, she had been subjected to severe abuse. For example, there's a woman named Miss Woodward, who was the PE teacher, and she would routinely throw children into the pool and that sort of thing. But one day she beat my mother black and blue. That would happen. And then on another occasion, she took my mother out of class and threw her into the deep end of the pool, knowing that my mother didn't know how to swim. And teachers stood around and watched as entertainment. And they pushed my mother under with a stick underneath the water over and over and over again. And the headmistress, Miss Wright, her favorite form of punishment was to lock my mother in closets and that sort of thing. And so, you can imagine that the damage that was done left scars, and that those scars impacted the relationship that I had with my mother. I never knew any of this. I didn't know who my grandmother was. I didn't know her name. I knew nothing. All of this was kept a secret to me my entire childhood. All I knew is that my mother was difficult. And so I took this journey, and I don't know what I was going to find, but it helped me understand what had gone on in my childhood home. And it helped me understand that the events that impacted my childhood home had happened, really even centuries before. And that decisions that are made on how to raise children can have impacts, down the generations. And so it was a really remarkable experience, and it hasn't stopped. After my book came out, amazing things happened. There was a piece in the New York Times that someone saw, and one of them was my mother's friend, who apparently she'd confided in, who called me and shared more about my mother. I got to meet all sorts of former foundlings who became kind of aunts to me. And I just traveled to London recently to see them. And it's been an extraordinarily healing experience for me. That wasn't why I went in. I was compelled. I was compelled to understand what had happened and why there were so many secrets in my childhood. And, and in the end, my husband tells me that I'm just like different, a different person in many ways, because I'm so much more at peace with everything that happened. And it was because I was able to understand the full context. And in a way, I was almost lucky, because a lot of us have, trauma in our past. And I got to go to London and see a big, huge, thick file. And my mother had written down various things, and I had a rich source to find out what happened. And not everyone, the scars are there, and a lot of times we don't know where they came from. But I know that I will let it. I know that we're going to have questions and at the end, but I'll go ahead and wrap up there and turn it over back to you, Dee.
Fantastic, Justine. Thank you. Thank you so much. And it's such an interesting story that you've mentioned healing at the end. There's a number of women that I've been speaking, older women that I've been speaking to recently, who would love for their children to understand their life. Actually, they feel as if, I guess, they've done something. They feel as if they've done something wrong too, and they would just like to understand where that came from. It's interesting the parallels that you hear around the world as well, because I know those stories of toys coming out for visitors. They've happened in Australia as well. Thank you. I'm going to hand over to the famous Rosie Canning now, because Rosie is going to introduce our next panellist.
Hello, it's wonderful to be here today in the Foundling Museum, where Dee and I first met in 2019. Little did we know just what an exciting and interesting journey we would have, and led us back here today. I hope that when Dee comes over next to the United Kingdom, that we can visit the Foundling Museum together again. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Dr Josie Pearse. Josie is an artist, writer and independent researcher into adoption history. She was surrendered as a toddler and spent a period of time in care in a residential nursery before being adopted. Her PhD that she undertook at Cardiff in 2013 is called Backstory, Writing on the Cusp of Life and Fiction. It's a creative reclamation of her unrecorded orphan story. Just over 100 years ago, an anonymous author answered a survey. It was sent out by a select committee looking at the regulation of child adoption. Tracking the history of adoption, Josie traced a book written by the anonymous author. She presents a reading of it as a testament to creative human resilience under the restrictions of the child welfare system.
Thank you for your introduction, Rosie, and thank you to everybody who's spoken so far. Oh my gosh, how exciting is it to be able to bring these life stories of these foundlings here into this room now. And thanks to Rosie and Dee for helping us do this. So my foundling is a woman that we know as Hannah Brown, though I'll come back to her name later. I should have a slide with the cover of her book, but it's on the website. It's actually on the where you book your ticket for this talk. There's a cover of her book, which was written in 1919, just after the First World War. And this is the book I discovered. So I want to talk about a little bit about the context of me discovering this, and also what was happening in orphan care at the time she published. Specifically, my interest, I have to read my notes because I can't remember them all. My interest is in the way the Foundling Hospital closed the orphan off from their heritage, the severance of the mother and child bond, but also the severance of the child from any record of who they were and how they belonged in the world. What Charles Dickens, as Justine mentioned, Charles Dickens talked about in his essay, Received Blank Child. Received one child named blank. You've seen the forms that they use, and the blank was filled in by the institution. That practice of severance somehow transferred itself to adoption law, child adoption law, which first came onto the statute books in the era that this book was published. And indeed, the author of the book, I haven't mentioned the book's name, it's called The Child She Bare. Strange name for us, but it was called. The author of that book tried to stop that policy of severance from happening. So the year's 1919, the author was in her 50s, we think, because she dates her birth year as 1866. And she has come to be known as Hannah Brown, but it was published anonymously. There are two parts to the book. First, there's a chronological account of her time in the Foundling Hospital. I'll give you a quote where she reflects on her first Sunday after leaving her foster mum in the country. So here she is. Oh, what a terrible ordeal it was, my first Sunday at church. The memory is really vivid. The babies were placed in the first row of the gallery of the chapel. She's a baby. The bigger girls behind them. And in those days, we sat the whole of the service through and were not allowed to move. As we were not able to keep awake, the big girls would thump us in the back every time we nodded. When the service was over, each of the bigger girls placed the child sitting in front before her, and all walked in single file through the chapel, where the visitors crowded over the side to see the children. I happened to raise my eyes, no doubt fed up with the misery of it all. I may have thought that they had something to do with it. I must have been in a hateful mood, for I put my tongue right out at them. I love her. When I first came to the Foundling Hospital as an adult adoptee, when it very first opened, That's how I felt about that lot on the walls in the paintings, you know. I'll come back to that. Hannah's book is a difficult read. As she says, needless to say, such a spontaneous action never occurred again. I afterwards sank into the non-entity which the child who enters a pauper institution is bound to become. It was like the last flicker of the candle. And she goes on through the first part of the book to document the inhumane treatment. We're at the Being Human, we're part of the Being Human Festival. And at this period in its history, the treatment, but you know, it was, we can't imagine. I'll read a little bit of it later. I'm not going to repeat much of it though. I feel upset about it. And Dorothy Soames' life, what I read of Justine's book, is much the same. I'll come back to it in the context of Hannah's education. But the second part of the book is the two chapters at the end, which are very different. They're called The Evils of the System. And this was my way into the book, because I was researching adoption history. Just to broaden things out, after the First World War in 1919, there are a lot of orphans and a lot of single mothers, both widows and women abandoned in pregnancy, and they're struggling. On the other hand, there are an increased number of women in marriages who couldn't conceive. A large number of these women had husbands who brought back something they hadn't intended, from a transmittable disease. And at that time, doctors in England would not tell a married woman what was wrong with her reproductive system if her husband didn't agree. So if she had scar tissue blocking her fallopian tubes, for example, she wouldn't know. She was just an infertile woman. This was known at the time by the suffragettes. The suffragettes were onto it. And I get it from a very good book called The Stork and the Syringe by Naomi Fepper, which is a history of reproduction politics. So, but at the same year of The Child She Bare, the publication of that, there was a conference in London to examine the principle and practice of child adoption, to do something about this situation. The conference set up a select committee, and presumably as a consequence of her book, Hannah was invited to make a submission to that committee. But that's something for a foundling, isn't it? And I first thought that she was actually on the committee, and I thought, that's pretty good. But it was a submission by post, as far as I can tell. And she was the only person who was invited to give evidence who had actually suffered a complete severance from her mother. In her submission to that conference, she says, "You are creating a hydra-headed monster for the future." A hydra is a serpent, by the way, with many heads, and the killing of it is a second labour of Hercules. So our foundling is pretty educated. She knows the Greeks by this point. This is some of the report. Every child has an age, she says, "I am not in favour of the principle of child adoption. Every child has an inalienable," really have trouble with that word, "right to have the love and care of its mother." Something quite American about inalienable. Doesn't that appear in the Declaration of something? Independence, perhaps. Yes, so maybe she was in America, but I'll come to that. Motherhood is and always has been the most unselfish thing in the world, and no love is as pure. Women often insist they will work their fingers raw to the joints rather than part with their children. We must needs see the necessity of establishing the principle that this connection ought to exist. Any system which tends to encourage the transference of a child from its mother to strangers opens the way to tremendous evils. She then goes on to suggest a mother's pension. Now, I don't know if this was in the general debate at the time, but she says a mother's pension for all. Children whose parents or relatives are unable through poverty to support them should have special provision made for them. Now, it took another 27 years and another war for family allowance payable to a mother to come into law. So that was the debate at the time that her book was written. And in fact, she wasn't alone, along with most of the organisations invited to submit evidence to the Select Committee, who had been working with mothers and children for the past sometimes 100 years, with names like the Pimlico Society for the Rescue of Friendless Girls. They all disagreed with the principle of severing the mother and child bond. And they wouldn't have agreed with what the Foundling Hospital did. I don't want to give this impression that the Foundling Hospital was involved in this decision-making around adoption. I don't know either way, but Hannah gave evidence and she was saying, don't make the same mistake that the Foundling Hospital did, and I suffered. But the adoption societies, and turns out the governments, knew better. The child needed to be a blank sheet for the adopters. Where have we heard that before? And everybody gets a new start. They wanted everybody to get a new start. Just for flavour, I'll give you another submitted to that conference. Mr. Drysdale Woodcock from the National Adoption Society. Mr. Drysdale Woodcock is really good for a quote. Here we go. He is quite a woodcock, this one. At the present time, this country is faced, as France has been faced for a long time, with a prospect of a rapidly diminishing birth rate. It is common experience that large families tend to be born to people who are least able by financial position, education and training to bring them up properly. It would, in my view, be better, therefore, that the excess of these families should be taken by persons who really desire children and have not got them to read. This distribution of families, or what would be called by some the breaking up of the family, would be good for the child if the child were given a better environment, material and moral, than its own environment. So that was the view that prevailed. And let's pause. This is the children being handed to fathers who couldn't even admit that they got them in France, and to their wives. You know, this is strange moral environment. I'm working on trying to discover why the law eventually passed in 1926 included that severance of the bond that Hannah was so against. I think there might be a story there, but actually, perhaps not, because the governments did the opposite of what they were advised, and that happens all the time, right? Back to Hannah and her life. What a journey she must have taken from being the non-entity that a pauper child must inevitably be, to being the author of a book, The Cause for Change, and knowing she has the right to be heard and publish a book and speak to truth to power, even if power is deaf. There is very little hint in her early years about her sense of power, and she's not educated in any sense that we would understand at this point. For example, even though they're taught to read and write, they're never or rarely allowed to read for pleasure. The only time they're allowed, only time the children had books given to them to read was on Sundays at 5 o'clock in church. When she talks about learning, she says, I was not fond of lessons. Dictation, reading and scripture I did fairly well. Sums I could not understand. I'd always been too much afraid of the teacher to give my mind to her. That is very insightful about what education needs. And also, she has insight into why she's treated so badly. She says the monitors, they were asked after supper, I think, or dinner, they were told to go and lie on bare boards, and the monitors oversaw this, not the teachers. The monitors were horrible to them. But she said they wouldn't have been so harsh if they hadn't been treated that way. Perhaps she did this to me because it had been done to her. And she's not alone. There are a lot of these foundlings that have spirit, even though they're subjected to such a nastiness that most of us would find incomprehensible. The foundling girls have amazing spirit. For example, there's a nurse whose favourite instrument of torture is the hoop and the stick. Those toys that you see on the top of nice biscuit tins or chocolate boxes, little girls in frilly Edwardian dresses. It's that sort of time, playing with the hoop and stick. Somebody used those as torture, and they get bruises from these implements that they daren't show to the doctor, because in fact the doctors were also on the case. They would question, at this time, they would question wounds that the children had. But you know what? They called her the whacker behind her back. That was her nickname. I love that. I love that. That kind of spirit is irrepressible. Sometimes when you read in the book, in The Child She Bare, you almost feel her spirit could be finally beaten when she's training as a servant in the apprenticeship. It is, but it isn't. The children, as you've heard, don't get to leave the institution behind really for 5 years after they've moved out. They have to prove themselves. They're monitored in what's called an apprenticeship. She calls herself a slave. Is actually indentured labour, and it's often the other servants in the houses who treat her with the most contempt. At one point, she's threatened constantly with the workhouse by one of the mistresses, and in the end, she screams, "Well, let them, and I'll send me to the workhouse, and I will be the very devil." Yes, we love her. We love her. So at this time, she is wearing a kind of brown sacking. This chocolate box, you think this chocolate box child, and this is London in the 1880s or 1870s, and the music halls and all those lovely embroidered dresses. She's wearing brown sacking. So she's identifiable as an orphan girl or a charity child. I had an Auntie Vi, actually, who used to call me at times. I can see her, little orphan girl. It was like, it was a dig. But this is, I didn't have to dress in that in the 50s. Anyway, and I never did. What's really clear with Hannah's description is that she has no choice but to stay in servitude. What jumps out at me is that she's so lonely. At least in the Foundling Hospital, she had her friend. They have 1 day off a year when they're in servitude. Whit Tuesday, which I think might be a good day for a Foundling Day. Anyway, Whit Tuesday they have off and they get to visit the Foundling Hospital. And she talks about going back to the hospital, and I imagine a group of girls hanging out in the playground, swapping stories. Apparently one girl who was considered stupid, even by Hannah, and nervous, stupid and nervous, even by Hannah and her peers. She tells them her mistress calls her the scum of the earth. So the people outside the Foundling were as contemptuous in some ways as some of the teachers in. She does mention the organist. The organist in the Foundling Hospital, the organist was a good guy. They really had fun singing with the organist. Anyway, but this 10 years later, when she's 25, she meets this same girl who was called the scum of the earth on the street. They're both 25. The girl is dressed in an attractive nurse's uniform, and Hannah says her face has become beautiful and it beamed with intelligence. And she says, how have you done this? How have you managed to free yourself? I've tried so many times. And the girl says, some lady took an interest. So that's what it takes, that's what it took. Unfortunately, the only copies of the book are in the British Library, and I am writing to the publisher to see what state the rights are in, because we don't know anything about Hannah. We don't know anything about her after the book until 30. So do we think writing her story made a difference in her life? There's no way of knowing, because she remains a blank adult, as Kathleen was saying, as she was a blank child. We don't know who she is, really, where she lived or how long. I suspect she became a mother because she slips into the point of view of a mother once or twice in the book. But I don't even know if she was truly called Hannah Brown, because the Hannahs who were admitted in 1866, according to the Quorum Archivist, are known to have died before this book was written. I've been talking to him, and he's in touch with the blogger who first called her Hannah, I think. And as I say, the publisher, I'm going to try the publishers. So I want to say, when I began, I said I related to the Hannah poking her tongue out with the great and good when I first came here. And I've had moments of a sort of PTSD, kind of, I lost my keys. I lost my bag once when I came here. And I feel that there is something, this symbolized. I was looking at the tokens that time, and it sort of taught me that there's a link between losing my identity through closed adoption and the severance that those tokens symbolize. It has an effect. It's really strange. It just has an effect. And I'm happy to say it's changed. There was a fantastic exhibition of orphans as superheroes in the basement. And I really understood representation, because I went to that exhibition and I could finally go upstairs with an open mind after that exhibition. So I was very grateful for that. But I think this care experience and culture moment for me here today is a way to acknowledge the orphan labour, really, that contributed to the wealth and entertainment of the good and became servants of the empire. I think, Justine, you bring that up beautifully in your book. I hadn't thought of it before, that people were educated for empire. And this is a fantastic way to acknowledge it. So, thank you. Bye, Zoomies. Bye, Zoomies.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
One of the things that I've noticed tonight is that it's a lot about class, isn't it, this whole system? It's about social class. And I was just wondering whether you might like to comment on that, because your mother, Justine, was very clever at classing as upper class.
Yes.
And I know that was difficult for you, but it was what she did, I think, was extraordinarily clever, and certainly shows that class isn't about anything that's inherited. Clearly that was taught. And then, of course, Hannah Brown goes into, servitude and things like that. I wondered whether you wanted to comment on the classed nature of this whole system.
Certainly. I mean, my mother was taught that she was, lower, that she was less than class, that she was barely human. And so the most important thing for my mother was status. And in fact, I grew to really resent it. My mother, it was just all about status and who had the bigger car and who had the nicest house and all of that. And the interesting thing is that my mother was very snobby. And that always bothered me as well. And so it's, so interesting later in life to understand where that came from, and that, you know, some of the snobbiness that she had was really about feeling inadequate. And it was also interesting how she became very classist. You know, she definitely ranked, and she ranked people. And the interesting thing is that she ranked people based on their accent. And she was always quick to comment on, you know, what is the, you know, the proper British accent, and all of that. And as you read in the book, she tried to get me to have a proper British accent. As you can see, it didn't work. And despite her best efforts, and now living in the South for a little while, I've been told I have a little bit of a drawl. So, which would have horrified her. So
I remember you talking about needing to learn the Queen's English, but you were very clever too, because you would do that maybe in some situations, like around your mum, but then in other situations, do whatever you wanted to do.
Well, I mean, I grew up in California, and I think that, you know, at the end of the day, you learn how to speak from, you know, your peers and all of that. So, and she tried to have me, you know, I had handwriting lessons, I had tap lessons, ballet, all of that. And, you know, she definitely saw success in the way that sometimes, you know, she watched, you know, Masterpiece Theater all the time. So of course I got addicted to all that too. And, you know, she saw success the way that you would see success in some of those shows of, you know, I play the piano and you have a nice voice and a lilt and all of that. So it was, and she really had to do a lot of work to get there. You know, and it's clear that she worked on her accent, and that she worked to change her accent, which was very interesting because my father was from Tennessee, which is in the deep South, and you have a very thick accent. And when he moved to California, he told me that he worked very hard to get rid of his Southern accent, because in the United States, there's a stigma with the Southern accent that if you have a Southern accent, somehow you're not smart. And so he worked on that. So, you know, both of my parents changed their accents just to change the perception that people were having of them.
But you mentioned the healing, Justine. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that and in what way. And you said that your husband reckons you're different. I was wondering if you could perhaps talk a little bit more about that.
Well, I was very angry at my mother. I mean, I harbored a great deal of anger in most of my life. And you know, and I understand now that, you know, anger is a protective mechanism. And so I understand that. But, you know, going through the whole process, you know, some people like to say that I forgave my mother, and I did not say that. But I think that sometimes that's interpreted, that's how my book has been interpreted. But what I did do is I came to an understanding. And once I was able to understand what happened, and that my family was caught up in this history, and, you know, a dark history, and that a lot of what happened wasn't necessarily anyone's fault in my family, I was able to just release some of the anger that I had. So
it is important, that discovery, isn't it? That it's not, it feels intensely personal. And we take that on very personally, but it's not personal as well. It is part of a whole historical thing. Right. Rosie, do you want to say anything before we do finish up?
Wow, what an event. Such interesting presentations. Thank you to everyone who attended in person at the Foundling Museum and online from different parts of the world. Our thanks to curator Kathleen Palmer. It was so interesting to hear about the PhD research project that's tracing the life stories of about 15 African and Asian children that were at the Foundling Hospital from approximately 1740 through to 1820. And people can visit the Foundling Museum to find out more at the Tiny Traces exhibition. Justine, thank you for such a heartfelt presentation. Letter after letter after letter, month after month, year after year, that your grandmother wrote trying to find out about your mother. she never gave up. And eventually they were reunited. It's just a shame that your mother left that bit out of her memoir. Maybe one day somebody will be able to tell the rest of that story. And Josie, absolutely fascinating to hear how Hannah Brown was invited to make a submission to the select committee set up to examine the principle and practice of child adoption. Hannah was the only person invited to give evidence who'd actually suffered a complete severance from her mother, telling the committee they were creating a Hydra monster for the future. Absolutely fascinating stuff, and really quite interesting because we've actually seen over the years the way that children in care, those that have left care with care experience, have been excluded usually. I know that's changing now, but on the whole, anyone with that sort of experience was excluded from committees and panels and presentations, and my God, there are so many of them. So it's even more fascinating that here was somebody with the experience of not adoption, but of losing her heritage, her history, her name, her family. So thank you very much.
Justine Cowan's book, The Secret Life of Dorothy Soames, should be readily available to buy from wherever you normally buy your books if you don't have it already. Kathleen Palmer talked to us about the story of George King. Unfortunately, his memoir is not currently in print. If you'd like to know more about George King, you could look up the Fighting Talk event on the Foundling Museum website. Josie Pearse told us about The Child She Bare by Hannah Brown. The only place you can find that at the moment is the British Library. Dr Josie Pearse mentions some relevant books during her talk as well. Naomi Pfeffer, The Stalk and the Syringe from 1993, and John Boswell, The Kindness of Strangers. There are a couple of editions available. This one is from 1988.